Hey everybody, hope you guys are doing great today. We're going to go ahead and jump in with moral anti-realism. So if you remember when we started off, what we're interested in is we're trying to figure out, are there any factual answers to how we should act? Right? We're interested in these questions about normativity, that it's not just that some people happen to do such and such things, eat meat or do whatever, but should these people do these things, right? And what we want to know is, are there any factual answers to these questions, right? Is it correct to do this, or is it incorrect to do this, or is it all just personal preference or maybe cultural preference? And so that's what we're going to be digging into today. We're going to be trying to figure out, is there any objective reason to do certain things? Is there any objective sense of morality? And so what we want to do is, first, let's distinguish between two major camps. So moral realists, right, are people that think that there really is a moral reality, right? So, right, if I'm a physical realist, or if I'm a realist about God, the idea is I just think, that there's a physical reality, or God really exists. So the point of realist in philosophy is just to say you don't think it's purely mind dependent. You don't think it's just something that would disappear once the last human disappears, or something like that. So a moral realist wants to say morality really is real. So just like when you say that, hey, that game went fast, or something like that, and you could say there's a true, that is a true description of that event, right? Like that, to say that that sporting event went quickly, or right, like that meal was very sloppy, or what have you, right? Like we can describe events, and we can say these are very real features. And the idea is, a moral realist wants to say we can also describe them with moral terminology too, right? Like that killing was heinous or wrong, right? And they want to say that's just as applicable of a description. That's just as correct of a description of these things. To say that, right, a situation was loud is one type of description, one way of describing the world. To say that it was immoral is another equally real way of describing the world, the moral realist wants to say. An anti-realist, on the other hand, is going to say, no, morality, there is no moral features like there are physical features or these other things. So, but a moral anti-realist is going to say that morality is just in your head, or just in the culture. But it's not correct just to say definitively that a situation is negative, or is evil or good, or something like that. So, right, like I can say definitively that, that game went fast, or something like that. But the moral anti-realist is going to say you can never just objectively attach any moral terms to anything. Moral terms are always just subjective, right? They don't ever have any clear power like these other features do. So we're going to be interested in two types of moral anti-realism, specifically cultural relativism and error theory. So let's go ahead and dive into both of these. In the first one, I'm just going to be working more with intuitions, and in the second one, we're going to look at some actual arguments. So if you remember last time, right, we looked at what an argument is and how we can pull those apart. We're going to be using these tools throughout the course. We won't use them on absolutely everything, because sometimes, right, it can feel like we're getting bogged down in the technicality, and it's good just to return just to some intuition. But it will provide a really useful way of for us to try to parse into what's going on with a lot of these theories. So we'll be bouncing back and forth between using those tools, sometimes more often, sometimes less often. Okay, so what is cultural relativism, right? And so how can we understand this as a version of moral anti-realism? Well, so the idea of cultural relativism is that they want to say an act is morally acceptable or required just in case a person's culture permits or demands that act, right? So if your culture permits an action, then it's acceptable. If it demands that action, then it's required, right? So the idea of cultural relativism is, it seems to be somewhat, right, like you might be sympathetic to this for a number of reasons. First of all, it makes morality very clear and unmysterious, right? What is morality? It's just things that humans do, right? If you want to know what the moral things are, right? These aren't these mystical moral features that like science can't detect and stuff like that. These are just things that cultures have decided upon. And so in a sense, it becomes very just scientifically straightforward. Right? If I want to explain to you what morality is, I just need to essentially do anthropology, right? Or sociology. So a cultural relativist is someone who thinks that just, yeah, when you say that something is right, what you really mean is your culture condones it, right? Rightness just always boils down to a culture, right, promoting or condoning a certain action. And another attraction of this is that it makes things very straightforward for morality, right? If I'm a cultural relativist and I'm living in a society and I want to figure out, should I eat meat? All that I have to do is ask, does my society like eating meat? Right? There's no question beyond that. All that rightness boils down to is just this question of what does your culture do? So, right, in this cultural relativism and all these anti-realist theories, these are versions of meta-ethical theories, right? These are answering these meta-ethics questions about what do you even mean when you say something is right or wrong, right? A cultural relativist just says when you say that something is right, what you mean is your culture likes it, right? And that's all that rightness really comes down to for a cultural relativist. So in that, it's easy to find my answers, right? How do I figure out if it's right to do something? I just have to ask, does my culture care for it? And I mean, another reason why this is attractive to some people isn't just these maybe more pragmatic reasons of right, like it just being scientifically respectable or it being right, like easy to find solutions, but maybe more of like an ethical reason that like, hey, this makes it so if I'm a cultural relativist, I don't think any culture is inherently superior to any other culture. Right? The point of cultural relativism isn't to say that this culture's norms are better than that culture's norms, right? It's to say that every culture has their own norms and they are all on an equal footing, right? Every culture is independently just as good as every other culture, right? And this is also, a lot of people will think of this as attaching to some sort of sense of tolerance, right? I can't go into your culture and say, no, you guys better start eating meat or you better stop eating meat. I have to accept, like, no, that's your culture. This is my culture. And, right, I'm not going to impose what I do on yours. So these are some of the classic reasons why people are drawn to cultural relativism, right? The idea is, well, it seems to fit just like how we approach science, at least like sociologically, right? We don't say that different cultures are bad, we just accept whatever they do, right? It makes our answers easy because we just get to, anytime we need to figure out what to do, we just have to ask our cultures, right? It makes it so that I'm not judging any culture as better than any other culture, and it seems like it makes it so I really am a tolerant person so long as I'm a cultural relativist. So these are some of the classic reasons why people are drawn to cultural relativism. But what about some of the concerns? Well, so first off, about this tolerance thing, that's only actually important or valuable so long as your culture values that thing, right? If you're living in an old school Viking culture, right, in centuries past, then you really don't value tolerance. You value pillaging, right? And that's what's morally good if you're a Viking, right? Not tolerance. If you live in an intolerant society, tolerance is bad, right? Let's put it like this. An action is morally acceptable or permitted, right? If a society requires or demands it, acceptable. An action is morally acceptable, required. Oh, right. If it's permitted, good. Right. So the idea is, if that society demands that you don't be tolerant, then the morally right thing to do is not be tolerant, right? So this means that cultural relativism, to the extent that it accepts whatever the culture's norms are, must accept whatever the heinous things that culture thinks are okay. So, right, again, going back to some 10th century Vikings, right, if they think that, hey, raping, pillaging, and stealing from others is totally good, then cultural relativism just has to nod its head and say, yeah, okay, cool. I guess that's what's good in that culture, right? And me over here in my culture, right, maybe I'm not going to do those things. Maybe I don't think they're good, but I have to just say those truly are good for the people that do them. Right? So this is a very strong, very big bullet to bite, right? This idea that, like, oh, on the one hand, we thought we were being very tolerant of things, but on the other hand, well, shoot, no, we're not. The only way we could be tolerant is if our culture explicitly requests it, and that's just simply not true for all cultures. And on that note, right, that's going to open the door to a lot of other things. So let's continue on. In addition, we can't make progress, right? If there's no way for me to say these norms are better than those norms, if I have to say two different cultures' norms are always on par, they're always just as good as each other's, well, then I can never say that this culture at time zero or this culture in the year 1 is better than the culture in the year 0, right? Or this culture in the year 2026 is better than the year 1835. Right? I can't actually make sense of progress. I would just have to say, no, these are just different cultures, and they have different ways of doing things. Sure, one of them endorsed a slave trade, and one of them didn't, right? But they're just different cultures, right? That's what this cultural relativism, just by definition, entails. Okay, so with that, right, I can't actually, like, so just continuing on this for just a moment, there's no sense in which I could say, hey, let's change our norms. Hey, we have this rule right now, let's fix it, right? Or, right, suppose we did change a norm. There's no sense in which I can say, that was a good thing for us to do, right? I just have to say, well, those sets of norms and these sets of norms are just on a par. They're just different norms. And all that rightness is just to say, you're fitting one group of norms or another. Okay. So finally, cultural relativism doesn't really give us any guidance for what we should do if we're in more than one culture, right? Or if two cultures need to collaborate on something, right? So, like, what if two different or a group of cultures are trying to put on something like the Olympics, and they have different ways of going about things? Cultural relativism just says each individual culture is right in how they do things. So should they all just, like, just stick their heels in the sand and just, like, completely be stubborn and say, no, my culture's view is the right way to do this? And the point is, there's just no guidance on this naive version of cultural relativism. It's just saying, I was just thinking everybody would just sit in their own culture and do their own thing. And similarly, suppose you're a person in multiple cultures, right? Suppose you're a first-generation American from another country or something like that, right? And you speak a different language at home as you do at work, as you do in social life, right? What do you do when those cultures conflict? What do you do when you're on the dance team and the basketball team, and there's a meet on the same day, and both of them want you there, right? Maybe there are answers to these questions. Moral realists would like to think so, right? As we'll look at soon enough. But the point is, cultural relativism doesn't give us any of those answers, right? Cultural relativism is just going to leave us with saying, like, oh, well, I'll tell you what to do if you're just one person living in one culture. But I can't really tell you how cultures should interact or what you should do if you're part of multiple cultures. So I should emphasize this is a very naive version of cultural relativism. But this is also the most straightforward version of cultural relativism, and the version that you often run into when dealing with people that are maybe new to philosophy or something like that, right? This is for better or worse, right, a very common view for people to take very early on in their ethical pursuits, right? It seems very nice and tolerant and egalitarian. And it's only after we look at these very just immediate and problematic consequence that we start to see, well, maybe there's a reason to start looking a little bit further. Most philosophers that are tempted away from realism and towards anti-realism typically jump ship from relativism and go just straight for error theory. Cultural relativism isn't, it's not completely absent among philosophers by any means. There certainly are relativists. Usually they'll try to do something slightly more sophisticated than just this. But typically, if you're persuaded by anti-realism sentiments, if you're doubtful that there truly is a morality, oftentimes philosophers will just go straight to error theory. Error theory is the idea that it's not that there truly is a morality, but it's just subjective to each culture. Instead, error theorists will just say morality is just a pure fiction, right? There's just is nothing that is morality. When you say that you ought to do something, it's not that it has some sort of like cultural, like that we should respect it even in some sort of like subjective way. It just means that it makes you feel good, right? Like that, or it makes somebody that's saying it feel good, right? So like the error theorist wants to say when somebody says don't kill, really that's just Disney Channel or the church trying to persuade you not to kill, just to keep you following in line, but there's no true rules. It's all just what people have said, right? So an error theory is going to think of just morality and all of this stuff as just Disney Channel nonsense, right? Just oh, you don't actually have to do the right thing, right? That's what we tell kids because we don't want them getting too rowdy, but there's no such thing as the right thing, right? That's error theory. And so, like, one of the common justifications for error theory is this argument right here. So, right, we're dealing with arguments. So the idea is here are two premises, and these are trying to justify, or these are purporting to justify this conclusion. So what we need to ask is, do we think the premises are true? And if they are true, do they entail the conclusion? So, like, in this case, let's think about the validity question first, right? If the premises are true, do they entail the conclusion? Well, so let's try to understand this argument. If there is rational disagreement about an issue, then there must not be a correct answer about the issue. Okay? There is rational disagreement about morality. Therefore, there must not be correct moral answers. So, do we think this is a valid argument? Well, we should, right? Think about what we just went over last time. The idea is, we just looked at these arguments, yep, right here. Both of these arguments had this same form, right? If A, then B. A is true, therefore B is true, right? That's exactly, just move something. That's exactly what's going on over here. If there's disagreement, then there's no answer, right? If A, then B. There is disagreement, therefore there is no answer, right? So here we have an argument that fits exactly that valid structure. So if I accept these two premises, I really should accept that conclusion, right? The only way for it to be false, there's no correct answer, right? The only way for there to be correct moral answers is if either there's truly no disagreement, or if disagreement doesn't actually entail there are no answers, right? I would either have to reject premise 1 or reject premise 2, but I would have to reject something if I wanted to reject the conclusion. That's what we mean by a valid argument, right? So the point of this and the point of like that logic is to try to home in on exactly what it is we want to figure out is going on in this argument. Here, it's valid. If I accepted these premises, I really would have to accept the conclusion. So the one thing I can do now is if I don't want to accept the conclusion, is I can try to figure out which of these premises do I think is false. And if I can't figure out, if I can't determine that either are false, well then maybe I should actually think, maybe I should revisit this and think, well, should I really accept that conclusion? So let's think about this. Let's think about premise 2 first. So, right. So first, if the premises were true, could the conclusion be false? No, right? The argument is valid. But let's talk about these premises. So for premise 2, there certainly is moral disagreement, right? Rational moral disagreement, we could even say. Now, maybe you want to split hairs and you want to say, oh, if you're disagreeing, you're not really rational. and that's a route to go down. There's potentially something there. Um, I think you don't necessarily need to go down that route, even if you do want to reject this conclusion, and that's because of the first premise, which we'll get to in a second. But like, it's plausible to say, yes, there are reasonable people that disagree about what we should do, right? That like, yes, we can find people that are well informed and like have actually thought about this carefully and in other parts of their lives really conduct themselves appropriately. But when they talk about a particular issue, like, I don't know, eating meat or immigration or abortion or even just should you tell your friend if she doesn't look good in that or whatever, right? That they actually disagree, right? That's at least plausible enough to run with for a moment. So suppose there is rational disagreement. Should we accept premise one? If there's rational disagreement about an issue, does that mean there's no answer? Well, absolutely not. Right? Like that's just absolutely false. Right? Like, I mean, this is definitely a classic thing for error theorists to go back to, or at least like right initially when they're first cashing this out. But like the whole point of science is disagreement, right? Like it's constant, right? Like that's the point. We're constantly putting up different hypotheses and trying to figure out which one is actually correct. Before we decided, or before we right gained confidence that like, yes, it really was the dinosaurs that or it was the meteor that killed the dinosaurs, we were disagreeing about it. Does that mean before we found out it was the dinosaurs that before it was the meteor that killed the dinosaurs, there was truly no answer? Well, that wouldn't make any sense because we just got the answer, right? My point is, suppose on one day, right, we finally confirmed the answer that the dinosaurs were killed by the meteor. The day before that, we were heavily disagreeing on this. Obviously, this is an idealization. But that doesn't mean the day before that there just was no answer, because that would make it so that there would be no answer for us to find on the very next day. So, like, the idea that disagreement means there aren't answers just shows a complete lack of understanding of what science is doing in itself, right? Like, we disagree on things all the time. That doesn't mean there's no answer to the question, right? Like, mathematicians will disagree about whether or not they think the Goldbach conjecture is correct, right? That doesn't mean there's not an answer to these questions, right? I might disagree with my partner about whether or not, hey, do we think that the car will actually make it home? That doesn't mean that there's not an answer to the question, right? She thinks that it won't. I think that it will. It actually does. Turns out I'm right. It actually doesn't. Turns out that she's right, right? There's an actual answer to these questions, right? Even if there's a disagreement about it. So just because there's rational disagreement does not mean that there's not necessarily an answer. Okay, so this is a classic starting point, but one that's important for us to diffuse. Now, as we go throughout all of this, it won't always be obvious when arguments are just clearly bad. If it was always obvious, philosophy would be easy, and we would make our way through ethics and find the correct moral theory without much trouble at all. But we're starting off with maybe some more naive approaches, like this argument from disagreement or this naive version of cultural relativism, just to get our feet wet. Right? Just to show us what it does look like when we can find an argument and find some clear issues with that argument. As we go, it might be harder to pin down whether or not we do think there are issues. But right now, we're just trying to see what does it look like when we do have maybe some low-hanging fruit. Okay, so what about another argument for why we should be an anti-realist, for why we shouldn't believe there are moral truths in the world? Well, one is specifically about science, right? So they might think like, oh, sure, like, I wasn't appreciating really what science is before, but let me lean into that and talk specifically about science. So here's the argument. If science cannot verify moral features exist in the world, then there must not be any moral features in the world. Science can't verify this, therefore they must not exist. So what do I mean by moral features, right? This is what I've been talking about, just in terms of you can describe something in terms of physical features, its size or shape or duration or loudness or intensity. And the idea is a moral realist wants to say, and I can also describe them morally. I can say that that was a crime, or right, that was heinous, or that was disgusting, or that was problematic, or that was immoral, or that was evil, or that was good, or that was praiseworthy, or that was whatever. Right? They want to say there truly are moral features in the world. And so you might think, like, well, no. If science can't verify that there's something in the world, then it can't exist. And science can't verify when something is like good versus evil, right? Science can't do that. Science never says like, yes, I ran this test and therefore this thing is evil. So therefore there aren't any of those moral features. And so again, we can ask our two questions, right? First, if the premises were true, could the conclusion be false, right? Is this argument valid? So again, suppose you wanted to say there are moral features, right? Suppose you wanted to reject this conclusion. Well, then we could say, well, suppose there are moral features. Then either we would have to say science really can verify them, or just because they can't doesn't mean we shouldn't believe in them, right? And like that sort of thing might feel abstract or a little confusing at first, but like the point is we're just narrowing down exactly what we would have to reject. So what I just showed there was that, yes, this argument is valid, right? If I accepted these two premises, I'd have to accept the conclusion. So the point, and I hope you can see the intuition here, is now I should either be rejecting, if I don't like this argument, I should either be rejecting that science can't verify it, or is that a necessary requirement? Right? I'm either going to reject that, well, science doesn't need to be able to verify the existence of something for me to be able to believe in it, or I'm going to reject that science can actually verify it, right? So the point is, I'm narrowing down what are my potential responses to this argument? What are the things that I can say about this argument to try to refute it, to reject it? And right, if I can't go in either of these directions, then that's what tells me that, okay, maybe there's actually something going here. Maybe I actually should be accepting that conclusion. Okay, so the idea is, yes, this is a valid argument. If we accept the premises, we really do have to accept that conclusion. So do we accept these premises? So let's start with premise 2 again. So, yes, right? Science really can't verify the existence of moral features. This isn't really anything that's terribly controversial. The idea is, right, this really goes back to the good old-fashioned, ethics, normative versus descriptive. Science is concerned with description. Like, not just accidentally, like it happens to do a lot of describing. That's what it's solely about. Like, at the very fundamental core, all that science can ever do is just say, hey, I watched these things and then I watched these things, right? There was a correlation between this event and that event. This happened, then that happened, right? Science never tells us whether or not that was good, right? That's just not part of the language that's used. That's not part of the justification. That's not part of just what's happening, right? So that second premise that science never tells us about moral facts, that science never verifies moral features, that's a true statement, right? I can never do enough studies or do an experiment that tells me, yes, that's a morally good fact, right? Maybe I could do things that show like, yes, this person's happier, or right, this person really appreciates this, or she feels legitimized or something like that, or validated. And somebody can report to me and tell me sights and sounds of what's going on, but to say that that's actually good, to say that any of this is good, right? The classic thought is, well, that's not science's domain. Science just tells you what does happen, just describes what happens, but doesn't tell you whether or not these things are good or bad, right? So this is the very classic approach to this question. Now, so let's think about this first premise, though. Suppose science can't verify that moral features exist. Should we just not believe in them then? And this is where most moral realists are going to be pushing back, right? Moral realists being the people that really do believe in these moral features. And the answer is going to be somewhat straightforward and in line with what we were just saying about this is that, well, no, science can't verify these things, but also that's because that's not what science is designed to do, right? It's what you might call a category mistake. That science is about these things over here. It's just not about these things over here, right? So like one way to think about or diagnose what's going on in this premise is it seems to be coming from just a general approach to thinking that science is the arbiter of everything we do and know. And science is certainly extremely influential, right? And it tells us a vast majority of what we know, or at least portion. Maybe I shouldn't say majority. But so like science is extremely important, and I believe in a lot of things, particularly because of science. Electrons, cells, exoplanets, right? Galaxies, all of these things, right, are verified or corroborated, or I only believe in them because of science. But it's a very strong claim to say you only believe in things because of science, right? Like anything that science can't verify, we shouldn't believe in. So, right, like let's think about just this statement in itself. So, suppose you wanted to believe this claim that says you should only believe in stuff that the science can verify. Well, should I believe this claim right here? How can science verify me that claim? It can't, right? Like, I mean, that's there's no amount of like tests I can do that say, oh yeah, look at that, science works. That's how justification works, right? Like, oh look, how many beakers happened in whatever way, right? Like that's just not. We have starting points for science, right? We have right methodologies for science. Let me maybe give you a better example. Take the statement 1 + 1 = 2, right? I don't believe that because of science. That's not something we go out into the world and observe and put 1 and 1 together a whole bunch of times and then we just count and then look at that, it's 1 + 1 turned out to be 2 again, right? Like look, I think we're onto something here. 1 + 1 probably does equal 2 every time I do it so far. It's been 2, right? And I'm right, like that's what science is ultimately just about, inducting off of these experiences, right? It is about just saying like, hey, I'm watching these things happen, and so I'm going to try to make a general claim about these things. But that's not how we justify plenty of our beliefs. That's not why I don't believe 1 + 1 because I've watched it happen a bunch of little times, right? Instead, I have a different justification for why 1 + 1 = 2, right? Again, if you're interested in that, that's a much deeper, more complicated topic that we could get into in logic or in math. But the idea is mathematicians in general and logicians in general don't do experiments, right? The way that they justify new mathematical theorems and things like that is through things like what you might call like pure logic or something, or right, just analyticity or conceptual analysis or other things. And so a moral realist isn't going to be wanting to try to figure out, or at least the vast majority of moral realists, save for maybe some radical, isn't going to be wanting to find out morality through science, because they're going to think that just doesn't make any sense. Just like I don't try to figure out mathematics through science. I do mathematics through proofs. And likewise, we're going to be thinking about this something similar with morality. How can we try to find out moral rules not through just finding them in science, doing scientific studies? I mean, sure, we should be scientifically informed, but no scientific study is going to tell us what the nature of goodness is or something like that. So what we want to do, how we're going to actually approach these sorts of things when we get into some moral realism, is do conceptual analysis. Do things sometimes closer to what a mathematician might do, right? Other times it might be just closer to what other researchers do, that just start from plausible starting points and just try to see what happens, right? Set aside, right, whether or not we have a firm empirical or analytic foundation. Just let's take a plausible starting point, like don't cause suffering for no reason, and let's just see what happens as a result of it. But the idea that we need to turn to science to verify that there are moral features in the world, anti-realists are just going to think like that's just not a concern. That's just not what science is after, and that's just not what morality is. So they don't really feel any teeth to this push. So these are our two versions of moral anti-realism. And the point of these is just to show you how some initial approaches or some initial resistance to ethics can be cashed out. This is not, and both of these face some pretty serious problems. This is not to say that there aren't any professional philosophers that don't endorse versions of either cultural relativism or error theory. But to fully appreciate the moves that they make and the ways in which they cash out their views, we really need to see some of the other considerations, questions, and theories in ethics. These are typically thought of as kind of like the naive first approaches that people might take. When you think about morality, oftentimes a philosophy professor is faced with trying to first explain, like, well, hold on, let's step aside from relativism and just a naive version of either relativism or error theory, and let's try to think a little bit more carefully about whether or not we should accept these moral features as real or anti-real. So we've seen a little bit of these guys. We're going to be revisiting a form of anti-realism later on, and this is going to be a more sophisticated, a more nuanced approach to rejecting that there is an objective morality. But what we need to start with is just getting clear on some of these not quite great reasons for resisting it. That way we can work our way to maybe getting towards some of maybe the better ones for doing so. Okay, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and take it easy.